signs that had been present for a long time. Some cases begin with a gunshot. Some cases begin with an emergency call in the middle of the night. But there are also tragedies that don't stem from a single moment. They accumulate gradually, over years, through seemingly small actions. A controlling word, a decision made on behalf of someone else, an apology after every hurtful act. Then, gradually, it all becomes a vicious cycle that even the victim may not realize they are trapped in. That is the story of Sarah Henshaw, a mother of 2 daughters. A daughter who always cared deeply for her family. A woman remembered by her friends for her warm smile and open personality. But behind that image lay years of living in a relationship where control gradually replaced love. To understand what happened in the summer of 2023, we have to go back more than 10 years. In 2012, Sarah first introduced Darren Hall to her mother, Lorraine. To Sarah, he was the man she hoped would bring a new beginning. At the time, she was raising young children and longing to build a stable family. But from their very first encounters, Lorraine sensed something was wrong. She noticed Darren frequently interrupted Sarah while she was speaking. He often answered for her in many conversations and always wanted to know where she was, who she was with, and what she was doing. Individually, these actions didn't seem too serious, but collectively, they formed a pattern of behavior that Lorraine couldn't ignore. Sarah, at the time, saw things differently. Like many people in love, she believed it was just an expression of affection. Over time, their relationship continued to develop. Sarah and Darren moved in together. Those around them saw a young family trying to build a new life. But behind closed doors, the balance in their relationship began to shift. According to what was later presented in court, Darren increasingly wanted to control every aspect of Sarah's life. He wanted to know where she went, who she met, and frequently made decisions for her. It wasn't physical violence. At least not yet. Therefore, very few people realized the seriousness of the situation. By 2016, Sarah was pregnant with their second daughter. What should have been a happy time for a family turned into a turning point in their relationship. According to the case file, during Sarah's pregnancy, Darren committed acts of violence against her. After an incident involving a strong blow to the stomach, Sarah had to go to the hospital for a checkup for the baby. Fortunately, the child was unharmed. But for those who later looked back on the incident, it served as a very clear warning sign. Despite this, Sarah didn't leave him. This is what often leads outsiders to question, why didn't she end the relationship right then? The answer isn't simple. A pregnant woman, caring for young children and gradually becoming isolated, often faces countless psychological, financial, and family obstacles. Leaving such a relationship isn't a decision that can be made overnight. It took Sarah about 2 more years to find the resolve to end their life together. Around 2018, she brought her 2 children back home to Ilkeston and began rebuilding her life as a single mother. For many, that should have been the end. But for Darren Hall, it never ended. There's a seemingly small detail that later became a crucial element in the entire case. Darren still kept the key to Sarah's house. That key was never returned. The lock wasn't replaced either. Over time, Sarah and Darren remained in contact as they co-parented their daughter. This meant Darren still had a reason to be present in her life. By April 2022, after her grandfather's death, Sarah began to see things differently. Her family said she became increasingly determined to cut off all contact with Darren and close this chapter in her life. But that decision turned out to be the most dangerous turning point. Because just over a year later, one evening in June 2023, Darren Hall walked into Sarah's house with the very key he never returned. None of them knew that it would be the last time Sarah would see him alive. Nights of Sarah's disappearance, June 20th, 2023, began like any other day. Sarah spent most of her time with work and her 2 daughters. For her family, she was gradually settling down after years of trying to move on from her past relationship. Although she still needed to stay in contact with Darren for the sake of her children, Sarah had made it clear that she wanted to keep her distance and move on with her own life. This information matched the events described in the case file. No one knew that it would be her last day alive. According to the investigation documents, Darren came to Sarah's house that evening. What particularly caught the investigators' attention was that he didn't break down the door. He still had the key. This seemingly minor detail later became a crucial clue. It shows Darren was still able to enter the house without Sarah's consent, even though their relationship had long since ended. The first few minutes inside the house had no witnesses. There were no cameras. No one overheard the entire conversation. What investigators later learned was pieced together from phone data, witness statements, crime scene evidence, and digital evidence. According to the records, the encounter quickly became tense. For months prior, Sarah had been trying to draw clear boundaries between herself and Darren. She no longer wanted to continue the relationship and hoped he would respect her new life. For the prosecution, Sarah's increasing independence was unacceptable to Darren. They argued that he always wanted to maintain control, even after they were no longer a couple. As the argument unfolded, no one outside that circle knew the situation was spiraling out of control. What made the case particularly heartbreaking was that Sarah's 2 daughters were the reason she maintained a certain level of contact with Darren. It was this connection that made completely severing the relationship so much more difficult. Nights of Sarah's disappearance, June 20th, 2023, began like any other day. Sarah spent most of her time with work and her 2 daughters. For her family, she was gradually settling down after years of trying to move on from her past relationship. Although she still needed to stay in contact with Darren for the sake of her children, Sarah had made it clear that she wanted to keep her distance and move on with her own life. This information matched the events described in the case file. No one knew that it would be her last day alive. According to the investigation documents, after the confrontation at home, Sarah stopped contacting everyone as usual. The messages that family and friends were expecting didn't arrive. This quickly made her relatives feel uneasy. Initially, many still hoped it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe her phone battery died. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she just needed some quiet time. But as time passed and Sarah still didn't appear, the worry gradually turned into panic. The family decided to report it to the police. Immediately after receiving the information, investigators began reconstructing Sarah's last known activities. They verified the calls. They checked the phone data. They interviewed relatives and neighbors. Every timestamp was carefully recorded. One of the first lines of investigation was to find people who had close relationships with Sarah in the time leading up to her disappearance. And the name Darren Hall quickly became the focus of attention, not just because he was her ex-boyfriend, but also because their relationship history showed worrying signs, as Sarah's family shared with investigators. Investigators began gathering more data from phones, area cameras, and related electronic devices. That's when they discovered crucial information that could reconstruct the events of the night Sarah disappeared. This evidence not only revealed Darren's whereabouts, it also helped determine the sequence of events after Sarah stopped communicating with anyone. This digital data chain became the foundation of the entire investigation that followed. And when the initial analysis results were released, the case was no longer considered a typical missing person case. Investigators believed they were dealing with a murder case. Electronic data and pieces of the truth. When an adult suddenly disappears, investigators always begin with one question: what were their last hours like? In Sarah Henshaw's case, the answer didn't come from witnesses. It came from electronic devices, cell phones, location data, security cameras, and thousands of digital traces that each person inadvertently leaves behind in their daily lives. Immediately after taking on the case, investigators began reconstructing Sarah's entire timeline of her last day. They examined calls, text messages, movement history, and the last people she contacted. Every timestamp was recorded. Every gap was questioned. During this process, Darren Hall quickly became the focus of the investigation, not only because of his previous relationship with Sarah, but also because the data collected showed he was present during the crucial period before her disappearance. This is the direction of the investigation reflected in the documents you provided. Digital forensic experts began extracting data from phones and other electronic devices. For many people, a phone is just a communication tool. But for investigators, it can become a nearly complete diary, an unlock code, a location signal, a network device. All of these could contribute to reconstructing the events of the case. In parallel with analyzing electronic data, police continued to interview Sarah's family, friends, and colleagues. These testimonies gradually formed a clearer picture of her life in the final months of her life. According to testimony in court, Sarah was trying to build an independent life. She wanted to focus on caring for her children and minimize Darren's interference in her private life. For the prosecution, this was a crucial detail. They argued that Sarah's increasing assertiveness had strained their relationship. Meanwhile, investigators also searched Sarah's home. The crime scene was meticulously documented. Every clue was collected and compared with existing data. No single piece of evidence was sufficient to conclude the entire case. But when piecing the pieces together, investigators found they began to form a logical sequence. This is also a principle of modern investigation. Testimony needs to be verified by data. Data needs to be compared with physical evidence. And any conclusions could only be reached when all the elements supported each other. Over the next few days, the police continued to expand their investigation. They reviewed security camera footage in the relevant areas, examined the movement history of the vehicles, and gathered additional digital data mentioned in the case file. Each analysis further narrowed down the possibilities of what might have happened. By this point, the investigative team no longer considered this a typical missing person case. They believed Sarah had become the victim of a criminal act. After gathering all the evidence, the police proceeded with the next steps in legal proceedings against Darren Hall. However, the arrest was only the beginning. To successfully convict in court, prosecutors needed to demonstrate that the entire chain of evidence was consistent and compelling enough to overcome any reasonable doubt. That was the biggest challenge of the case. Because the defense would undoubtedly examine every testimony, every piece of data, and every loophole in the record to defend their client. Therefore, before entering the courtroom, investigators had to ensure that every crucial link had been verified. This meticulous preparation laid the groundwork for the next trial. And there, all the evidence gathered over months would be presented to the jury to answer the most important question: what really happened to Sarah Henshaw the night she disappeared? Hours of trial and unmissable evidence. After months of investigation, the case entered the prosecution phase. For Sarah Henshaw's family, this was more than just a trial. It was an opportunity for what had happened over the years, behind closed doors, to be brought to light. For the prosecutors, the biggest task was to prove that Sarah's death was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of a long process of control and violence. When the trial began, the jury heard the full account of the case. From the time Sarah met Darren, the changes in their relationship, their separation but continued contact for the sake of their children, up to the events of June 2023. Each timeline is corroborated by evidence gathered during the investigation. According to the case file, a significant part of the prosecution's argument is electronic data and testimony from family members, showing that Sarah had been trying to build an independent life before the incident. Next, the prosecution presented testimony from the victim's family. Sarah's mother told the jury that she had repeatedly worried about Darren's behavior toward her daughter. Initially, these behaviors were simply about wanting to know where Sarah was, who she was meeting, or frequently answering on her daughter's behalf. But over time, she felt her daughter was becoming increasingly insecure and controlled in many of her life decisions. This testimony is not intended to prove guilt. Instead, it helps the jury understand the context of the relationship before the incident occurred. Then, the investigators present the results of their analysis of the electronic data. Experts explain how they reconstructed the timeline from phones, digital devices, and other data collected during the investigation. Each individual piece of data reflects only a portion of the events. But when combined, they form a linked chain of events. This is also the foundation the prosecution used to reconstruct the final hours before Sarah's death. The defense presented a different perspective. They demanded that the jury carefully consider each piece of evidence and emphasized that all conclusions must be based on very high standards of criminal law. According to them, it is impossible to conclude someone's guilt based solely on emotion or assessments of past relationships. That is why the trial devoted so much time to forensic experts and investigators. They explained the methods of evidence collection, how the crime scene was preserved, the process of analyzing electronic data, and why they believed these results were reliable. For the jury, this was the most important part. They were not just listening to the two sides' stories. They also had to assess whether the chain of evidence was strong enough to reach an unquestionable conclusion. In the final arguments, the prosecutors stressed that the case could not be viewed as a single, isolated event. According to them, the entire context of the relationship, prior signs of control, and evidence gathered during the investigation needed to be considered. Conversely, the defense attorney suggested the jury focus only on what could be proven by direct evidence. After several days of deliberation, the judge instructed the jury on the legal principles to apply before they left the courtroom to deliberate. It was the most tense moment for both sides. Sarah's family waited in silence. The prosecutors reviewed the case file. The defense attorney also prepared for all possibilities. Finally, the jury returned to the courtroom. All eyes were on them. The verdict was announced, closing the trial and determining Darren Hall's criminal liability based on the charges in the case. This outcome is consistent with the events reflected in the documents you provided. For the justice system, this marks the end of a case. But for Sarah's family, the sentence is just the beginning of a journey to learn to live with the loss. The verdict ends the trial, but doesn't end the pain. When the trial ended, the courtroom fell silent. For the justice system, the case was closed. But for Sarah Henshaw's family, it was only the beginning of a life without her. No verdict can bring Sarah back to her two daughters. No verdict can compensate for the years her family lost. After the verdict was announced, Sarah's relatives shared that what hurt them most was not just the loss of a daughter, a mother, or a sister. What tormented them even more was the warning signs that appeared very early on. Looking back at the whole story, they realized that the relationship wasn't just about arguments. According to the case file, there were also acts of control, isolation, and pressure that lasted for many years. These elements were considered by the prosecution to be crucial context for understanding the entire case. For many experts, this is also what made the Sarah Henshaw case so widely discussed in the UK. This shows that violence in relationships doesn't always begin with visible wounds. Sometimes, it begins when a person gradually loses control of their own life. Being spied on, being controlled, being isolated from loved ones, being pressured in daily decisions. Each individual act may not be easily noticeable to outsiders, but when prolonged over many years, they can create a vicious cycle of control that is very difficult to break. During the trial, prosecutors also emphasized that the case should not be viewed as something that happened in just one evening. According to them, to understand why the tragedy occurred, one needs to consider the entire course of the relationship over the preceding years, including controlling behavior and the events presented in court. That is also the biggest message the case leaves behind. Small signs should not be overlooked. A person who is constantly controlled. A person who always needs to explain their whereabouts. A person who gradually cuts off contact with friends or family. The problem may not be limited to just one relationship. Sometimes, these are the signs that need to be noticed before it's too late. After the trial, many people remember Sarah not through the heartbreaking details of the case. They remember her as a mother who always put her children first. A daughter deeply attached to her family. A woman trying to rebuild her life after the end of a difficult relationship. According to relatives in the documents, Sarah longed for a more peaceful life for herself and her children. This desire resonated deeply with the public. For investigators, this case also highlighted the increasing importance of digital evidence. No single witness saw the whole thing. No single piece of evidence can explain everything. But when testimony, electronic data, autopsy results, and other evidence are pieced together, they form a logical chain sufficient for the court to consider and make a judgment. That's how many modern investigations are conducted. Not based on speculation, not based on emotion, but based on verifying each piece of truth. Today, The Sarah Henshaw case is frequently revisited in many British crime dramas as a cautionary tale about the consequences of controlling behavior in relationships and the importance of recognizing early warning signs. Behind every criminal case are real people, families living with loss, children growing up without a mother, and questions that will be asked long after the trial ends. Thank you for following the entire Sarah Henshaw case file. If you are interested in real-life cases, evidence-based investigations, and objective analysis of the crime-solving process, please subscribe to our channel to explore more real-life criminal cases.